Good evening, everyone. Hope everyone has had a wonderful Monday up to this point. We are going to move into our pre-meeting item. This is the 5-year capital improvement program and the potential bond referendum. Mr. Roberts?
All right. I think I'll sit here in case Jackie needs to speak. She can jump on that mic, and that way it won't be going back and forth. And then we got Patty over here too. But a couple things we want to talk about tonight. First of all is we want to talk about a 5-year CIP, which I don't know if Larry, Patty going to pull that up, but you've probably seen. Yeah, we were going to talk about that too. Either way, we can go with what you got up here is fine. But we want to talk about the potential bond referendum, the 5-year CIP, and also the 5-year financial forecast. We may get into that a little bit. But when we talk about bond referendum, Jackie probably take this over and talk to you about timing, scheduling, et cetera.
Will you pull up the Excel document first? Will you pull up the Excel document first?
Cool. And we're on the same page. All right. Either way, we're going to hit them all. So what you have before you here is the CIP, 5-year CIP. You've probably seen this more than you care to see it. And you will continue to see these projects over and over and over and over again. Because, as you know, these projects, Main Street was a project that's probably been talked about for 20, 25 years. Some of these other projects have probably been on there 10, 15 or more years. It takes that long sometimes to get through the process to get these approved and actually get to construction. So I don't want to get into every one of these projects, and because we've talked about these individual projects many times over and over, but more than happy to discuss any project that you like to. The point here is just to say, when we get to talking about bonds, is what you see before you is the name of the project. If you recall, we have these sheets for every project. It kind of tells you details on every one of those projects that you'll have in your package. And it kind of gives you an estimate of the price. But as you should know by now, until this project goes out to bid, there's no way that number on this sheet is going to be exact. You won't know until it's bidded. That's when we'll know. We'll have a firm number. So these numbers you see 2, 3, 4, and 5 years out, no way it'll be that number.
With history as an indicator, sometimes we won't know after we open bids because we might not have settled on the right-of-way price.
That's right. Even after we know the bid, some of that right-of-way is not settled, and you go on 2 and 3 years after the project before that's settled. But the key thing here is we've got to fund these projects. Can't pay cash for all these projects. Most of us in this room probably didn't pay cash for a house. Maybe you did, I didn't. So we got to look at ways of how we finance these projects, whether, for a building or a house, you may do like an installment financing. But for roads, when you don't have collateral, you look at other means to pay for those. And a lot of times, what towns look at is bonds, and you lump a bunch of these together and you go after bonds. On this sheet, when you see colors here, what we did when we were looking at debt and how we fund these projects, the red colors mean that we are looking at either installment finance. The only thing we look at installment finance is Town Hall, and you can see the $26 million number plus the $3 million or so is roughly $30 million. We will look at doing installment financing on that, but everything else you see in red as you scroll down through this sheet, we're proposing to use some type of bond dollars to those projects. Now, some of the projects may have multiple funding sources. Some of these projects have CRTPO funds. Some have, may be out of, transportation funds. Could be bond dollars, could be multiple different funds. But if you see a red beside it, that means we are proposing in some shape, form, or fashion. We have to make some guesses on how we fund these projects and what the prices are. And what you see in the light blue on the end, these are future projects that we have not associated any funding with at this point in time for various reasons. So don't get too hung up on, oh, well, Anthony, you picked this one to be a red project. We want that blue project to be red. If you're looking just at the last category, and I just said, just leave it where it is, let's just say Irvin Cook Road Extension is $8.2 million, that one phase. I will bet you my house and car it won't be $8.2 million. I have no clue at this point in time. So don't get hung up on, well, it should be blue, it should be red, or we think it's going to be $20 million. No, it's going to be $2 million. If you know that, you wouldn't be sitting up here, I wouldn't be sitting here. We'll know that as we get further down the path. So as we jump into talking about bonds, and the reason we're talking about that is we've got to find a way to pay for these projects. So from here, unless you want to get into the individual details of every one of these projects, we're going to hop into talking about bonds. And, you know, some of the research that we did, if you recall, we had Davenport Lawrence. No, it was Davenport Lawrence?
Davenport.
Oh, Davenport, not Davenport Lawrence. There's two companies out there. Davenport come in and do some how do you pay for some debt calculations on how do we pay for various projects, et cetera. So from here, I'm going to turn it over to Jackie, and maybe she can jump into some of the bond discussions, and we'll hop into trying to hopefully lead you down
Just
the
a
path.
second, Patty. Will you go back to that just a minute? Will you go to the bottom where the subtotals are, where the totals are? Right here. So 64.5 million of these projects have been funded in a prior year. The total, Patty, I'm guessing 234 million, the total in column N. You've heard me, you like to hear me talk about fund balance, that's my good time. So we have, is it 58.5, it's something less than 60 million in fund balance, which is our savings account. If it's your intent to fund all of the projects on this list, if you were willing to spend every single dime in your savings account, which you can't do, you could not fund all of these projects. And so if we're going to do these projects, we've got to find another funding source. Call it 45 million we've got funded in FY24. Moving forward with Town Hall it is a significant, so 26 million that even if you took Town Hall off of this list, that's still almost $20 million worth of projects just in FY24. So we've got to figure out a way how we might fund this. Thank you. If you'll go over to the PowerPoint now, that'll be awesome. So there's a lot of words in this PowerPoint. Smart people who tell you how to design PowerPoints, they don't put that many words in it. I'm not going to read these to you. They were included in the packet. There are some things I want you to take away with you in addition to having a copy. The first thing you see here is the way we worded bond questions when the most recent time we asked the voters bond questions, which is 2012. We asked them 3 questions. Would you allow us to issue some parks and recreation bonds? Will you allow us to issue some transportation bonds? And will you allow us to issue some public improvement bonds? You must be careful in the way you word bond questions, because that's the only thing that you can spend bonds on. You can't spend street bonds on parks and recreation projects. You can't spend public improvement bonds in another way other than the way it's listed here. And so the street bond questions, you can spend it on the usual suspects. There is some non-transportation things in there, and certainly there's intersection and road improvements in there. Public improvement bonds, I would ask you to pay some particular attention to. So look at the way we worded that question. The first specific thing we said that we might spend public improvement bonds on were construction of fire facilities. When the voters gave us the authority to issue this $7.15 million, we did use half of it on fire station number 4. But notice the other things that are eligible to be spent on in the way we worded this bond question. The next thing it says is improvements to existing administrative and public safety facilities. So if we wanted to add on to the police department, we could have done it based on the way that question's worded. After we talk about administrative and police facilities, the next thing we talk about is many things associated with transportation-related projects. And so I invite you to think about whether or not you want to word first, how many questions would you like to ask voters? And second, do you want to word it similar to like this, or is there some other question you want to ask? There is no requirement that you ask these 3 questions. You can ask it any way you want to, and I would, if you want to vary appreciably from the way these are worded, I invite you to let me get a meeting scheduled between you and our bond counselor, Parker Poe. Scott Leo with Parker Poe's been in the business more than 20 years, and he is our bond counsel, and we're going to vary much off this script. We need to chat with him. Don't memorize the way this is worded. It's just an example of how we worded it last time. Calendar. Jackie, why are we talking about this if we don't want a bond referendum till November of this year? Not unlike Anthony, there's a reason, Anthony just described, there's a reason we do some things here in what I'm going to call black ink and some things that, in red ink. The red ink are the things that we need board action on. Black ink is things that staff will take care of. The first, if you intend to be on the November 23 referendum, there is board action you need to start as early as the second meeting in May. Anthony and I can't think it's a good idea that the town would issue bonds and just call up the LGC and say, hey, we want to be on a referendum this fall. It requires board endorsement that we're going to ask voters bond questions. That starts as early as the 15th of May. Where the rubber meets the road, I would say, notice the second meeting in July. The second meeting in July is where we're choosing the way we word the bond questions. I keep thinking I have to tell you next slide because I forget this is here. So there's a lot of staff activity. We've got it listed in black here, the November referendum. There are things we'll still need to do after the referendum. The election results have got to be certified, and then you have to accept them at the second meeting, at the first meeting in December. But think about how early voting starts, and so we have to notify the county how we're going to word bond questions, which is the reason why this calendar starts so early as it does. Happy to respond to any questions about a bond calendar. Yes, sir.
Just on that last one, the 12/4/23, my assumption is that certification would be done by the existing board before the new board is sworn in, because if I'm right, that would be the night that the new board would be sworn in.
I'm going to defer to Emily. I'm not sure whether that's new or old board.
All right. Just one. I figured it was, but just curious.
I've asked before, and so if voters approve a referendum in November, just because voters tell us we can issue debt, it doesn't automatically materialize. There are still hoops to jump through with the local government commission, and we might not necessarily want to issue all of it at one time. Frankly, I would advise against that because it's so hard to do that many projects at one time. So the paperwork and the bond rating agencies re-rating us, getting all of that together, I've been told the earliest, if voters approve debt in November of 23, the earliest we could issue debt would be 90 days, February of 24. I think it's smart for us to look at, we don't have to do anything just exactly the way we did it before, but that's an indication of how it can be done. So I would say it's a bit traditional here to ask voters for enough debt in Huntersville that what you think you might need to fund over the course of about a decade. Because let's assume that we ask voters in November of 23 to give us authority to issue debt. We have 7 years from November 7th of 23 to get that debt issued. If for whatever reason we don't get it issued in those 7 years, that would be, help me, 2030. If we don't get it issued by November 7th, 2030, we can ask the local government commission for an extension. I've never been asked for a reason of why we wanted to extend. with their permission, we can get a 3-year extension for whatever reason we have. The project didn't track as quickly as we thought it would. It took us longer to get right away, whatever. We can be granted a 3-year extension. And so if we don't get it issued after we get that 3-year extension, our authority to issue that debt will evaporate. It goes away on November 7th, 33. We have to ask the permission after 7 years, but we get a 3-year extension. And so, let's say we decide we want to ask voters for authority to issue $50 million in transportation bonds, and at the end of 10 years, we've only issued $45 million. There's no requirement that you issue every single dollar of bonds that voters gave you the authority to issue. I would call your attention to the 2003 referendum. We got permission to issue $20 million in bonds. We ended up, for whatever reason, not issuing $1 million worth of those bonds. That's okay. Just because voters told you you could issue it, it's not a requirement that you do so. The 2012 referendum, voters gave us authority to issue $30 million, and we did issue all 30 of that million. And you can see on this slide, theoretically, if you ask voters 3 questions, they could tell you yes to 1 or 2 of them, or all 3 of them. You won't necessarily get approval of all of them. The last 2 times we went to the voters, they did approve all 3. Yes, sir.
Yes, Jackie, the funds that are not issued, where does that money go? Does it go back into a fund? Or does it go back to the
So
government?
that million.
$1 million.
The 2003 bonds that were never issued, we had authority to issue that bonds, we just didn't use that authority. Think of it as a line of credit on your house that you just didn't use. But after that 10 years, it's gone away. You don't have authority to issue that anymore. So let me take a second here to also say, let's assume voters approved some debt November 7th, 23. We don't begin to pay interest on November 8th, 23. We have to wait and issue those bonds. And so the local government has always told me, don't try to play the market. Don't issue when you think interest rates are low, and don't be afraid to issue when they're high, because you can recall those bonds and reissue at a lower rate. Don't try to play the market. Issue the bonds when your project is ready. One of the reasons that the Local Government Commission is really specific about is if you're going to issue $10 million in bonds, let's say we decided we wanted a $12 million town hall. If we've not opened general contractor bids, the Local Government Commission don't want us to issue $8 million for a $12 million project without explaining to them where we're going to get that $4 million delta. Conversely, if we intend to issue a debt on town hall and we think it's going to be $12 million and the actual general contractor bids come in at $20 million, oops, we got a problem. So they want you to wait until you have, generally speaking, open general contractor bids, so you issue about the right amount of debt. I'm happy to respond to any questions here, but don't get in your head, oh, well, let's get the authority from the voters now, but since the Fed seems to be raising interest rates, we won't issue for a while. We need to do it when the project's ready. Mitch Brugulio with Davenport came in September, and he gave you all a copy of this notebook. It's ballpark 100 pages. There's a lot of stuff in here that I really enjoy reading. Let me tell you what I take out of it. So he suggested that if we issue ballpark $94 million in debt, let's call it $95 million in debt, that it would look like that would result in needing to raise the tax rate approximately 5.5 cents. Now, he's not telling you what type of debt. That could be an installment financing. It could be a LOBS, a limited obligation bond. It could be a GO bond, a general obligation bond, which is what you might go to the voters with in November, whatever type of debt you issue. Our financial advisors are extremely smart. When he's talking to you about debt capacity, he's not considering what else might go on in your budget. So don't think that this is a guarantee of either a 5.5 cent tax increase or that it would necessarily fund other things you might want or need to do in your budget, like perhaps begin to hire some employee firefighters or changes in what you might be paying for garbage collection. So all he's looking at is your debt capacity, not all those operating or personnel expenses which might go on. Additionally, when I tell you that he says it looks like you would need about a 5.5 cent tax increase, Also think about the last time we went to the voters in 2012, we suggested to them, it looked like if we used all of that 30 million in debt, we could see as much as a 5-cent tax increase. We didn't increase taxes 5 cents the last time we did that. There was some growth. There are other reasons why we didn't do that, changes in the revaluation, I'm sure. Just because the financial advisor is looking at how much you might be able to issue and what increase that might result in, that's not a guarantee. So we have numbers back from the county based on the revaluation. And remember how Mitch said, it's pretty smart, for if a penny on the tax rate last year generated a little over $1 million, little less than 1.1 million per penny. And so what does the penny generate now? And so now that we have an estimate back from the county, it looks like a penny will generate approximately 1.5 million. So if I'm rounding that 95 million, he said might result in a 5.5 cent tax increase, we've asked him to take a look at it again. Now that a penny would generate about $1.5 million, if we were going to issue approximately $1 million in debt, how many cents on the tax rate does that look like that might cost us? And as you could see here, it's a little under 3 cents. If you were, and it will matter, when you issue the debt. So again, we wouldn't issue $100 million in debt at one time because we don't have the staff to administer that many projects at one time anyway. You're probably going to issue that in some number of increments over 5, 7, 10 years. And so you can see some specifics here. And so if you were okay with a 5-cent tax increase, how much debt might that issue? It's $200 million, last bullet point. Yes, sir.
I'm pretty sure I understand this, but I just kind of want to put it in maybe different terms. When we say like the 100 million would result in a 2.8 cent tax increase, would that be, and it's going to be 3 different ways I'm looking at it, would that be on top of revenue neutral, on top of our current tax rate, or is it just a matter of whatever the tax rate we pick, they're saying 2.8%, 2.8 cents of that property tax rate should be dedicated to paying that debt? Sorry if I
Here's the way I would word that. It doesn't matter whether you go revenue neutral or not. If you at our current valuation, it looks like if you wanted to issue about 100 million in debt, it would result in a 2.8 cent tax increase. So we will have already adopted a rate in June for FY24 when we go to the voters. You might go revenue neutral, you might not. But he's saying at our current value, it looks like it would take a little under 3 cents to cover debt on $100 million. So it won't matter whether you go revenue neutral or not.
One thing I would say here on the bullet point that Jackie mentioned, the $100 million debt resulting in approximately 2.8 cents. What you're going to see from us is what management would propose is we're looking at roughly $100 million in debt. So as you move forward, you're going to see some of the sheets sort of relate to somewhere around that number. And there's a rhyme and reason behind that.
But with that rate, it would still be up to the board at any point in time to increase that rate, and you wouldn't really look to implement that increase until the bonds were actually issued, correct?
You got to get them approved by the voters, and then you'll make your selection of what your timing is when you need to issue the debt. Did you have a question?
Yeah. Following up on Commissioner Munger's question, maybe I just didn't quite understand. When you say the current valuation, are we going with what the county has already said or what we've had prior to what the county said?
Our FY24 values, which would be the new values at FY24, not the old values from 20.
So if we look at that and then we say 100 million in debt and we set the tax rate at 19 cents, you're still saying it's 2.8 cents above that? So no matter what we set the tax rate at, it's going to be an additional 2.8?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I guess just to be clear on that, though, if the board says move forward with some form of bonds, and if it's, we'll just say 100 million, what you're going to see in the educational pieces is that your tax rate may increase by as much as 2.8 cents.
Round that to 3.
3, I'm just using what's on the page here, but probably as much as 3 cents. However, as Jackie told you before, typically what happens, they have no way of knowing how many buildings are going up in town. So they have no way of knowing all the $4.5 million of industrial square footage going up and how fast we're growing, et cetera. So, and they build some things in their assumptions, but there's no way to know that. So in your educational piece, you would put that, but most likely, due to revals, et cetera, it would not go up 3 cents. And this board, just remember, if this board says, let's move forward with a bond, that's not going to be, when we're talking about this year's budget, there's going to be no tax rate discussion related to this. Because you got to remember, in November, it goes to the citizens to vote on. Who knows what they do if they approve it. By the time you make any type of debt payment on that, it typically 2 installments, December, June.
June, yes, sir.
So it's not going to happen into a future cycle. So I don't want you to get hung up as, oh crap, I don't want to do bonds because tax rate, et cetera. Has nothing to do with this budget cycle we're talking about. Go ahead, Jackie.
Okay, so Mitch does this for a living. He'll show us as many scenarios as we'll tap out before he will. I think last time he showed us at least 4 scenarios. He emailed me at least 3. That's the update with the new values. I've been explicit. It does not make sense to me to ask voters about debt on town hall. I would recommend we do some type of installment financing on town hall. We won't be waiting for a referendum if we do that. At the point when we get ready to issue the debt, that's when we'll get banks to give us a rate and issue the debt on town hall. So think of debt in the generic sense, but when we go back to referendum questions, what are the items that we had on that CIP list that were in the Excel document that you might feel compelled to issue debt on related to parks and recreation bonds? And so if you look at the projects above this blue line, that should sum ballpark $18,650,000. There are other projects that sum $4.3 million in that Excel document. Please don't get hung up on, I want to fund this one, but I don't want to fund that one, because we will word that, here are some of the projects that the bonds might be used for. And so as you think about what number you might be comfortable with, are you comfortable asking a question about issuing bonds related to parks and recreation projects? Here are some of the projects we've talked about we think we might need money for. Is it 18 million or 8 million or 5 million or 50 million or some other number? And guess what? The next slide is transportation.
And before you go to the next slide, if you remember looking back, go back to the slide before. If you remember looking back at the CIP, can you go? Yeah, you go. If you remember looking back at the CIP, the stuff above the blue line is in red, park and rec projects. The stuff below the blue line was what's in blue in future years. So, and we didn't have a funding source for that. That's why it was blue on the CIP sheet, and we just stuck it in here. As Jackie said, don't get hung up on the numbers, because none of this stuff has been bid. And this is just here's the pot of projects that are in the CIP. You know, and the board would sort of need to determine out of park and rec projects, what is that number? Is it 18 million? Is it 22 million? Is it 10 million, et cetera? And Jackie sort of showed you what previous board has done in past years. And so. Anyway.
Don't get, so I would argue 2003, 2012, 2023, Huntersville has a history of asking voters for about a referendum ballpark every decade. You can go back November, you can ask them in November of 23, you can go back in November of 24, you go back as many times as you want to. I would advise against asking very frequently, because it looks like it's an expensive, it's taxing, it is taxing, but it's work for staff to get the educational materials together. I wouldn't ask that frequently. About every 5 years is about as frequently as I would ask. And so I invite you to think about what items are in the CIP that you would be compelled to consider funding. Yes, sir.
If no one else is going to ask questions, I'm going to ask questions. the previous referendums, we said street bonds, public improvement, Parks and Rec. Are you suggesting that we're only going to do a Parks and Rec and street bonds? Or will there be some sort of public improvement? Or am I just reading this wrong?
I think it's smart for you to consider Parks and Recreation and street bond questions. I personally, you're asking my opinion, I'll give it to you. I'm less compelled about public improvement. Why is that, Jackie? I find the things that we frequently use public improvement bonds for very easy to do an installment financing on. Quite frankly, there's many of the things on this Parks and Rec project list you could do an installment financing on. It's really hard to do an installment financing on street projects in 2023. Prior to 2008, banks didn't look super hard at collateral. Post-2008, you really need collateral. What's the collateral on the street bonds? You're not turning stuff into a toll road, so there's just not super collateral. And so I would encourage you to think about using GO issues for your transportation-related projects. You can, since you're asking them for authority to issue some bonds, most financial advisors will tell you the absolute cheapest debt there is to issue is general obligation bonds. And while I believe that's true, there is also a lot of issuance cost that you can avoid if you do an installment financing. So there's a sweet spot, so think about that. Bluntly stated, why would I word it this way? You couldn't necessarily kill one of these projects and keep a board from doing it by not doing a GO issue on these projects, because if a future board said, I want that Bradford Park expansion so bad, even though they wouldn't do a GO question on this, I'll just go out and do an installment financing for it, and theoretically you could still do that. I'm not sure that's the case with the transportation bonds.
All right, so, yeah, and I'm glad you pointed that out, because the public improvement I was thinking of was a fire station, which obviously you've expressed your opinion that an installment issue would be much more efficient or better. Just so it's out on the record, would it be more sensible to ask for too much and not issue all the bonds, or not enough and have to go through this process again?
It's my professional judgment. It's easier to ask one time and get as much as you think you might use, and there's no harm in not issuing it. If you don't ask for enough authority, then you're going back to the voters later. There is a instrument you can use to issue some debt through a product that's not necessarily referendum-driven. It's called the two-thirds issue. Help me do math in my head. If our debt service payments in a calendar year are $6 million, two-thirds of that would be $4 million. So you can get authority with the public hearings and such to issue $4 million in debt without going to a referendum. We're not Charlotte, we're not Mecklenburg County. A two-thirds issue is not going to give us much principal, and so in my opinion, it's easier to ask for more and not use it than it is to ask for one amount in 2023 and go back again in 2024 or 25.
I would just like to say, though, that we need to figure out what we feel like we can get accomplished in 10 years and not ask for more than that. That's just from where I sit, being responsible with those dollars.
I invite you to consider, too, inflation and how difficult it is to deliver a project at our current estimates.
That's fair.
I'd say have some rhyme and reason behind your number. For instance, if you were going to do Park and Rec bonds, if you took and said, I'm going to do all of it, that's $23 million, 18 plus the 4 or something. So, I mean, you have some rhyme and reason. You have, 5-year CIP. Don't just say, well, I'm going to do 50 million in Parks and Rec bonds. And you don't have projects associated with it. So, I mean, I would be cognizant of that.
It's finding that sweet spot. Commissioner Partee?
Thank you, Mayor. I want to look at the doomsday scenario. What if, in fact, because the bond's going to be, this referendum will be on the ballot with CMS bond, I believe this transportation, which they're debating downtown, and our bond, and this bond doesn't pass, what is our contingency plan?
My understanding, you could go back and ask voters at the next election for additional referendum. And I would argue some of your projects that you're not doing with a general obligation issue, if you could do them in installment financing or a limited obligation bond, that might not necessarily kill it. Look, many of us have been in this area a long time. You recall when Charlotte asked for authority to do the convention center, the arena, and they didn't get it, and then they went and found a different product and did it anyway. I wouldn't advise you a whole lot to be issuing a ton of debt on things that voters ask you not to issue debt on.
We'd have to go back to the drawing board because we've got some projects that you're committed to regardless. So we'd have to maybe look at either dipping into fund balance or something else. For instance, the park, Huntersville Greenway, that's a committed project that has CRTPO dollars tied to it. So either we would let those CRTPO dollars go back to them, and there are other projects. So we'd have to go back to the drawing board and kind of reassess how do we pay for certain projects, and some, may be put on hold, but some may have to find a different funding source.
There are examples of that
Jackie, Mr.
in this list. Yes, sir.
Go back one screen,
Maybe.
and it says Bradford Park expansion, $8.8 million. You're estimating that that's the title cost of the Bradford Park expansion. That's everything. And if what you're saying is that the town of Huntersville will do this, or is Mecklenburg County going to partner with us? How?
I'm going to claim to be your resident expert on issuing debt. I'm going to ask Michael to step up about what might be in that project and might not.
So that 8.8 million is not complete build-out, everything you see on the park master plan for Bradford, but that would be the amount we would be committed to. Now, there is hope that the county and Davidson will participate too.
But that's not in the figure.
That's not in that figure. No.
So that figure could be
That could be
5 million.
Well, no, the total project could be 16 million or 14 million.
So this is just our portion of the project.
Yeah.
And that expansion is going to expand the park, but it won't complete the park.
That's right.
Okay? And now for the Waymer splash pad, it's $1 million, and if there's any type of local nonprofit clubs that want to participate in that, are you figuring any of that into that?
We're not, no. But we still would go after grants and, other funds that are out there like we always try to do on any project that we do.
I was just going to ask where parkland acquisition would be located.
So we had those bubbles in our master plan that we feel like there's need for future parkland. So there's southwest part of town, which is near Huntington Green. That's one
I
area.
was thinking south.
Downtown, we talked about expanding Holbrook Park if land became available. Those were the two top areas we're looking at, but we got like 5 bubbles across town where we think additional parkland is needed for future.
But on here, Holbrook Park was on here as well too, though, separately than the parkland acquisition.
Yep, and then that one also states future years. That 4.3, part of that is developing any expansion.
Gotcha.
And one thing I would say is we're thinking about these projects 10 years out, even though it's 5-year CIP. If we're borrowing this money for potentially 10 years, most likely you're going to extend past the 7. We would look at partnerships, see it more CRTPO dollars to more grants, part of grants, et cetera. Obviously, we don't know whether we'll get those at this point in time, but we will continue to seek those partnerships, et cetera, with all these projects. But as I said, am I positive that the Bradford Park expansion is going to be 8.8 million? I'm positive it's not going to be 8.8 million. I can tell you that because I just don't know yet. But it could go down, it could go up, depending on grants and partnerships, et cetera.
Well, that's most likely why we'll be going after those partnerships and grants.
right.
Is because it's going to be more than 8.8,
That's right.
at the end of the day.
We may get lucky and the county pay for it off, so great. Take that 8.8 million and go towards something else.
Commissioner Kovacs?
This is for Jackie, well, anybody, actually. My questions come from the CIP. What is the Gilead, the US 21 mast arms?
Mast arms.
So out here at right here at 21 in Gilead, is the black decorative poles that have the long arm across, no wires. Any intersection you see in town now will have black mast-on poles. So that's called a decorative adder on any DOT project. So there won't be any strung wires. It will basically be a black pole, black, green, whatever, pole with an arm and the signal lights hang on it. All wires will go
What's
away.
Here at this
Yep,
intersection.
similar to what's here. And anytime you have that on a DOT project, it's called a, I guess they still call it decorative adder or betterment.
Before we completely abandon that Parks and Rec bond discussion, I invite you to look at how we chose to word the 2012 Parks and Rec bond. That included some flexibility to use some of that bond authority on HFFA. I thought you might find that noteworthy.
Follow-up question, and this is just, in 2012, when the voters approved this, was there a tax increase in 2012, and how much was that?
It wouldn't have been in 2012, because in November of 2012, there,
2013?
right, I'll go look it up.
There was a-
I'm sure, they're probably,
That debt has been paid off, right?
it would have been 20-year debt, so we would be late in it, and so we're 10 years into it. We probably refunded it. The 2012 debt, we would have issued over the course of 10-ish years, so I'm sure that it's not completely paid off.
Well, we did increase the tax rate at some point. I'm trying to remember by how much.
How much did you have, how much, Jackie, and, well, obviously you were not here, and neither
They
was I.
said up to 5 cents, but I feel like it was 3 cents total.
My point being is that once that debt is paid off, you're still charging the taxpayers that 3 cents, even though that debt has been paid.
We balance the budget every single year, and it is absolutely true that there is usually a compelling reason to keep the tax rate where it's at rather than reduce it when a debt service payment rolls off the books. There might be additional salaries, there might be additional positions, we might have additional garbage costs, or we might initiate a new program. Yes, it is unlikely that once debt rolls off the books that there is a decrease.
So if this passes in 2024, and there's there'll be a tax increase for.
It is I can say with confidence, I will be recommending a tax increase when we issue debt.
Commissioner
Yes.
Kidwell?
Yeah, I just pull up an old news article, because I was on the board back then, not for the 2012 bond,
For the increase.
but for the increase, and we went in 2014-15 budget year, when they started spending some of that bond money, it went up 0.0225 cents to a rate increase of 0.305 cents. And that was in June of 2014, just for. Yep, here you go. I got them right here.
Commissioner Munger?
I don't want to keep muddying the water, but think about the timing we have right now. We likely put out educational materials in the spring of the year. 2012 was a reval year, so was the 5 cents predicated on the old value or the new value? I don't know, but I invite you to consider the impact of revaluations over the 10-year period when you could issue the debt as well.
Just a follow-up question to Commissioner Boone's comment about if we raised the rate 3 cents to accommodate the issuance of bonds that we're doing. Every board thereafter, every single year, has the option of adjusting that property tax rate back down. So it's not like it, in theory, yes, it could be forever, but it could be 1 year. And we say, hey, we build all kinds of stuff, let's knock it back down 3 cents.
Absolutely, with a budget adoption, you set the tax rate every year.
Thank you.
Any other questions at this time? Okay.
We scheduled this for 90 minutes in hopes of, think about this,
Road stuff?
Okay, we scheduled this for 90 minutes in hopes of getting some direction, because at your next meeting, we'll be presenting the FY '24 budget. The meeting after that is when we will need to have written the bond order information that we will be asking you to vote on the 15th. Yes, sir.
So is staff bringing us a $100 million question?
So before you, what you have now is, I think Jackie showed you roughly 18 million in Parks and Rec plus 4 million additional. And then here's 60 million in transportation plus, I'm rounding, 17 million in additional projects. Based on sort of the analysis that we've run and based on, feedback we got from Davenport, if we're to recommend a bond to this board, or debt, let me just say debt would be in the vicinity of 100 million, I'm just rounding. 30 million installment financing for town hall, and 70 million in bonds. I'm just using round numbers, 30 town hall, installment finance, 70 million bonds, and you break that down however it may be, 60-10, 50-20, whatever. And we wanted to show you sort of the list of projects that are in the CIP. We have to, it's very simple for me. We have to find a way to fund these projects, or they eventually shut down. You can dip in the fund balance so much, but whatever Jackie's total number is, if you got 60 million in fund balance, is not gonna fund whatever it was.
230.
230, it's just simple math to me.
Anthony commented I should go to the transportation page. I'll point out to you, we have some commitments on some of these projects. Stephen, help me here. NC 115, McCord to 73. We've committed to that project, and so for purposes of our 5-year financial forecast, we've likely said that we need to fund that with fund balance, because we have to show an absolute funding source, not a, hey, we think we might go to the voters and the voters might approve it. There's too many contingencies in that. I would also invite you to consider that NC 73 cost share of 4.5 million. There are projects we've already committed to that it might be smart to use a debt instrument rather than fund balance. I'm sure there are others, but those are two that stick out to me.
So what else, what other slides we got, Jackie? Is that the last one, or was that?
I'm pretty sure that I'm done.
All right.
Oh, my goodness.
I would just say this, as the board
Stop
sits
touching.
and
Help me get
as the board sits and starts trying to decide how much debt the town is going to ask the citizens to carry, that, and because it's an election year, put something out there that you believe is responsible, so that as the voters come out and are looking at this, because one of the things that I want to make sure is that you're not putting it out there, asking for the voters to decide, and then, utilizing it, whether it's as a campaign issue or what have you. I'm just challenging the board to be leaders in this, that you say, okay, if this is what we need to move these projects forward, this is what we need. If you don't believe that, then don't support it. I hope that's fair.
So are you asking for another tie?
No, I am not asking for that.
So the version of the CIP that's in your packet, it doesn't show color, does it? Isn't it all? That's unfortunate, but we go back to the Excel document here, and I should have mentioned Stumptown when I pointed out NC 73, NC 115, McCord to 73, and the cost share, the ones that we've already somewhere down the road, an agreement on. Stumptown would be another example of those. The red projects from that Excel document, which I'm sad that you can't differentiate in the black and white version that we put in your packet, we have initiated design on some of those projects, and so if you decide, this is not the year, let's don't ask voters this year, some of those projects will stop, or we just have not identified, the funding source we've identified is a voter referendum. We decide we're not going to do that, then we just need to identify a different funding source or stop working on them.
Commissioner Munger, did you have another question? No? Okay. Commissioner Kovacs.
probably a dumb question, but Town Hall, it says that we are going to do 30 million for that. On this CIP, it says funded prior years 3.242 million, and then 24 is 26 million, so why are we?
Thank you for noticing there's a little difference there. I'm confident, I've not looked at it lately, but I'm confident we did what accounting jargon is a reimbursement resolution. So we got to pay the architect the bills that he's incurring now to work on this project, and we did a reimbursement resolution. A reimbursement resolution gives us the authority to, once we issue debt, to restore back to fund balance that money that we pre-funded to get the project started and off the ground, and we put that money back in fund balance and use it for a different project. So we can use debt for something we've already paid for with that reimbursement resolution.
Thank you.
I don't think that was a dumb question. I think it was a great, insightful question.
Is there anything else that you all need from us to Commissioner Munger?
So, I mean, we looking to put out a number tonight?
That was going to be my
My apologies.
So I would say that the sooner the better, because, and remember, this is not affecting tax rate this year. We're not talking about tax rate this year. We're going to have plenty of discussion on that later on. But as you saw sort of the timeline, if we are to move forward with bond, I think that first meeting in whatever, May, or first or second meeting in May, the board's got to take some action. So if we're headed down that path, we need to start getting our stuff together. So if it's more, Anthony, we've heard all this stuff tonight. I've had the spinning. When we come back, when's our next Monday?
Monday, we have theorized that we might have a budget workshop a week from tonight on the 24th. The Monday after that would be our regular scheduled board meeting where we'll do presentation of the FY24 budget. And then the next board meeting after that would be the 15th, and that's where we would have the bond order according to the calendar here, that start having you approve items to put a referendum together.
So May 15th is the drop dead where we make a decision on
Resolution.
the resolution
And
and the dollar amount.
Yes, and think about, so we put the packet together. Our items are due to Janet the Tuesday before the board meeting at 9 a.m., so we needed a week before the 15th. That makes it ballpark the 7th.
So do we want to have some conversation now around the amounts, Commissioner Munger?
Yeah, I mean, it seems pretty obvious that we need to commit to doing a number of these items. And just so I'm following along all the math, 30 million, which can be done in installment, doesn't necessarily need to be done in the bond. Then that's 18.6 plus the 4.32 plus the approximately 60 plus the 17.7, which is 100 million if I don't include town hall in the number. If I do, it's 130.
If you were committed to all those projects, I agree. I do better with round numbers. If town hall is ballpark 30 million, the 18 in parks plus the 4, call that 22. The 60 here down to the blue line in street projects plus the 17, I'm around that to 80. So if Parks and Rec is ballpark 22 and this is ballpark 80, those are ballpark 100 plus the 30 on town hall be 130.
And is that have like an inflationary number built into it in terms of we think that's how much it will cost when we're actually building it or how much it's costing today?
I would ask the directors what theory they used in putting these numbers together. I feel reasonably confident that the town hall number is going to be ballpark 30 million. I feel pretty, I can speak to that one. I think that one's pretty close.
Could have been
And we could control
15.
that. And if you pick a 10 million in parks, or if you pick a 50 million in roads, to me, you're going to take that 50 million as far as it'll go based on the progress of the projects at the time.
I would say these projects don't have 5- and 7-year escalators in there. I'm sure they don't. Now, Stephen may have some escalation there, but I doubt he guessed what the price was 7 years from now if we would issue it.
Yeah, we don't have a year-by-year escalation factor, but we do for the projects that we haven't started. We typically add between a 25 and 35% contingency number to the total number, again, because we haven't started and we won't be starting for years. So we do add a contingency factor in there. but it's not a per-year escalation factor.
I'm curious, because you've probably done this for a number of years. Hypothetically, you picked a project 5 to 10 years ago that's actually just recently started kicking up dirt, or like the Main Street project or something like that. How close were you on that escalator factors? And I'm nothing against you, because inflation's been crazy and the amount of ARPA funds has blown everything out of proportion. I'm just curious.
Sure. So one example I can think of is the Gilead Road West project. That initial project budget or estimate was a little over $6 million. It's currently at 17, and we're still not to let the contract yet. So it's tripled.
Gotcha.
But that's one.
Yeah, no.
Others have done well. We estimated the Vance project, and it's come in at the budget we last estimated. The initial estimate was a lot less, but it did hold better.
So I guess my overall point is they're asking for roughly $100 million, and that's based on best guesstimates of what we think that number would come in. And all of these projects, I would argue, it would be hard-pressed to cut any of them. So I absolutely would support $100 million.
Well, I would say that we're not necessarily selecting projects, though. We're just setting aside dollar amount for transportation and a dollar amount for Parks and Rec, because this board most likely will not be sitting here, 7 years from now.
We have well over $100 million worth of projects that absolutely should be done in this town, whichever ones they're chosen. So $100 million.
Jackie, just to be clear, though, on that 100 million, on the bullet point you had in your slide, that was $100 million in debt.
Right.
Was 2.8, potentially 2.8 cents. Not 100 million in bond, 30 million in installment financing, which is 130 million in debt, right?
I would say if you're concerned
Probably
that projects are going
3.5
to
cents.
escalate the way he just described, rather than that 100 million, that's the first bullet point under March of '23, you might be more interested in 152. Or you might say, you know what, I feel better about a total of 100 million, 30 million being town hall and 70 million among the others. And maybe rather than go back to the voters in a decade, maybe we go back to them in 7 years if we've been able to use all the debt authority we've.
But on what Lance basically said, it's probably like 3.7 cent or something like that, I'm just guessing, if it's 130 million versus 100. Probably could guess, calculate it, but that's just a ballpark guess. There you go.
Commissioner Kovacs?
When we're projecting for our budget, do we take into account the tax value of stuff that is currently being built? That we can't really do that yet, right?
The county.
During that year?
The county generates tax bills based on the value as of January 1. And so if you're putting in a $100 million project and you've only got $5 million into it by January 1, then the value that year is $5 million. And so in the next year, if you've done another $50 million, you had a gangbuster year, you got $50 million. So the next year it's valued at $55 million. My understanding is you're taxed at that $55 million. And if you finish it in the third year and you do the rest of the $45 million, then the final year you'd be taxed at, you're taxed at whatever the value is at January 1 that year.
But when we're projecting,
The assessor's office gives us an estimate every single year of what they project our value to be, even whether it's a reval year or not. And there is appreciable growth in Huntersville. Yes, ma'am.
And we do, in our 5-year financial forecast, we do some projections, 2.5%, 3%, 4%, growth factor, just sort of based on how the town grows, based on what new buildings coming into town. We make some assumptions.
yeah, because I think we're going to have a big boom over the next year or two once projects are finally finished.
And and we'll have some of that show up in a 5-year financial forecast, but you just have to remember, a $100 million project is not tons of money in the scheme of things for our tax rate.
Yeah.
Anything else? Commissioner Partee?
I just want to piggyback on Commissioner Munger's estimate. And I'm just want to ask Jackie, hypothetically, if we bump the number up to 125 million, just to give us some leeway room for inflation and other unforeseen issues that might come up. We can issue 100 million, and not use the 25 million and still not get penalized for that. Am I correct?
Absolutely, you could do that. That's an
Yeah.
option, sure.
Okay, all right, yeah.
Once voters approve it, you're not required to issue
Issue
more
it,
debt.
absolutely, correct. But we're covered in the event that, God forbid, the new town hall exceeds what the number that we projected. Okay, gotcha.
If you do new town hall as an installment financing, it won't be included in that general obligation
Right.
number anyway.
You do have to keep in mind, though, that there are going to be other referendums on the ballot.
Yeah.
Right?
So my thought process, I'm at the opposite end. I was thinking like less than 100 million because I'm worried about the other things being on there and on the ballot and people not wanting to say yes to all of them and picking what they think is most important.
To them.
Yeah, and having such a large number, like 125, 130, I fear that will not help us get the money that we need. I think that might scare away some of the voters. I was looking more at like 85 million.
I think that between now and May 15th, we can have these conversations and really hone in and find a place where we can figure out what that sweet spot's going to be. But I do hear you, and I share that concern, that level of concern. What can we get accomplished in 7 to 10 years? And we know how long projects take.
The other part, when I came up the 85 million, I'm looking at the projects and whatnot, and some of them feel like they're tied to other ones. So like the Hager Cook, that's $16 million. But then we were also Fire Station 2, those projects go hand in hand. So if Fire Station, this is just a scenario, but if we end up not doing Station 2 where we are trying to get land and can't, then is that almost $17 million project as high up on the priority list still? If we're not using it to access the fire station goes somewhere else. I'm just saying, there's some things that seem to be tied to other projects that,
That one isn't totally tied to the, right? So you got to sit, and at the end of the day, that's probably for another board to figure out.
most likely, yeah. But I was just figuring that into
I
my
hear you.
figure.
I invite you to think about, too, the fire station might be a great installment financing, so you might not necessarily want to use bond referendum for that. And so I'm going to argue with myself here, so maybe that might tamp the number down a little bit. But think about the things that are not on this project either. So you're going to be asked to vote tonight on the downtown plan, and in the downtown steering committee, there was a lot of discussion about what to do with Gilead Road, and maybe we should take it over ourselves, and maybe we do something. There's nothing related to Gilead Road on that list either. So if you were serious about doing that within the next 5 years, there are things that you might think of being compelled to do that are not on the list either.
And that's why I think when you notice the wording of these bond questions, they allow flexibility, because we may get one of these road projects and it may be quicksand. And you can't do it, or there's a graveyard under the road. There are things that come up that you just can't do it, and so you move to a different project, or new projects come up like the downtown master plan for sure. So what I would just say, Mayor, obviously this was a lot to take in tonight, but we need to be ready probably next Monday to really hone in on a number, because the next meeting after that is May 1st.
So we're going to set aside some time next Monday for this discussion.
And we'll hop into 5-year financial forecast, and we can hop in that a little bit now, but I think, I just don't want you to muddy this discussion up with tax rate for this year and all that, all the other stuff we're going to be talking about.
No, I think that you've given us a lot to wade through and consider. And hopefully by next Monday, we'll be in a better place as we are digesting all of these numbers.
If you'd like to look at those projects again that are red, that are dependent on us doing a referendum, I'm happy to show you that. Anthony, if you want us to go to the forecast, you just tell us where we're going now.
We can look at that. We're going to hit it again Monday night, probably delve more into it next Monday night. When's that, what's the date and time on that one? I know it's Monday, but what's the time on that one?
We asked, we doodled availability 4:30 to 7:30.
So we will spend a lot of time on that, and that's when we'll really delve into tax rate. But I think the latest projection, we'll just give you, we can sleep on it tonight. I think the last sort of run we had was, tax rate was at 19, is that right? Dropping from 24, let me make sure I didn't say it wrong. Is that right, Patty?
It makes me very nervous to be specific with you about a tax rate number because there's so many caveats, what's in, what's out, what's in, what's out. So you want to hear about that, let me know.
Right, we've got to, so we're going to focus on what's in this budget, what's all in it, what's not in it. But right now, we've sort of, we're landed on 19 cents. And I think Jackie's going to tell you what revenue neutral is. Go ahead, Jackie.
17.6 cents.
Yeah, and we didn't round the next digit, so 17, if you round it up, it's probably 17.7 is revenue neutral.
Revenue neutral is an estimate. The state gives us a spreadsheet that shows us how to calculate it. Think about the revaluations that you have heard happening in this area before. The assessor's office makes a good, educated guess on what the appeals loss will be. He don't know what that's going to be, but he's given us an estimate of what he thinks it would be, and that's what 17.6 cents revenue neutral is based on.
You want to explain the definition of what you're allowed to put in and not put in?
So as Commissioner Kovacs has already pointed out, there is some what I would refer to as natural growth in the system. Math don't work this way, but let's assume for the 4 years between revals that every single year our growth rate was exactly 3%. If you have a 3% growth rate, or average 3% growth rate since the last valuation, then the state's version of calculating revenue neutral is you should assume that you are going to get the 3% in a revaluation year also. And so we get to include that in our formula, and once you include that growth rate, natural growth rate in the formula, revenue neutral is 17.6 cents. You also have to neutralize the impact of revaluations. I didn't mean revaluations, I meant annexations. Yes, sir.
Commissioner Munger.
One of the things I read about revenue neutral specifically is that commercial property values actually increased at a lesser rate than residential property values. So if we went a theoretical revenue neutral, we'd actually be giving a tax break to businesses and still increasing taxes on residential because of the differential. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So
You
On
bring
average,
up an
yes.
interesting point, too. So when you get your invitation to renew your tag on your vehicle every year, that's got the tax on it, too, that calculates a new value on your vehicle. So revenue neutral includes an impact on those vehicles. So you will see in next week's packet on manager's recommended budget, we'll collect less tax in vehicle tax because at 43% average increase on real property to keep revenue neutral in vehicles, we're going to collect less tax in vehicles. Same theory applies, yes, sir.
Commissioner Kovacs.
When do we find out about Mecklenburg County's tax rate?
I suspect the county will be releasing, much like us, in the month of May, their manager's recommended budget.
I will tell you that I met with the mayors from across Mecklenburg last week, and there's quite a bit of, they're projecting some increases for themselves as well. I believe, who was it that said 5 cents? Was it Pineville?
That'd been Pineville.
I think it was Pineville that was going to increase their tax rate. 5 cents. 5 cents. So everybody's looking at a tax increase. They did not specify.
Yeah, I didn't hear any, we meet typically on a monthly basis with the managers. I have not heard from one manager saying they were going revenue neutral.
I haven't.
Now, that doesn't mean that they won't, well, that's what I'm hearing. Jackie, do you want to maybe just as another little educational piece, tell how, you know, if we go down taxes, other towns hold their own or go up, you know, what's our second biggest, you know, revenue generator and how that impacts that?
Sweet. Yes, sir. So more than 50% of our general fund revenue comes from property taxes, either on real estate, personal vehicles. Our second largest revenue source is sales tax. Every one of the 100 counties in North Carolina get to make their own choice on how they will distribute sales tax on sales generated in that county. Mecklenburg County chooses to distribute sales tax on a tax levy basis. So you're either doing it on a tax levy basis, on a per capita basis. Per capita is population. The way that's calculated is every local government, that's the county and all the municipalities in a county, they add up either their population or their tax levy, and you get a proportionate share of what your share in that pot is. So Mecklenburg County distributes on tax levy. How you get a tax levy is you take the assessed value times whatever the rate is, and that gives you an amount of tax. Okay, so let's assume that Huntersville goes revenue neutral, and we don't raise our, we go revenue neutral, and we're generating the same tax levy 1 year to the next. Or we just have that 2-3% growth rate in it. And others increase their tax levy because either they grew faster than we did, none of them are, or they increase the tax rate. If they increase their tax rate relative to what revenue neutral would have been, and we didn't, then they have increased their share of the levy. When consumer spending has been what consumer spending has been, you can get some, what I'm going to jokingly refer to as some forgiveness. You won't feel receiving a smaller piece of a bigger pie near as much. Consumer spending might not always be, Chicken Little, right? People are not always going to spend the way they have been. At some point, people will be spending less. So if there are less dollars to distribute and we're getting a smaller piece of a smaller pie, we will feel that. Sales tax is ballpark 25-30% of our general fund. And so you lose a chunk of your second largest revenue source, you will feel it.
So that's all the education I got for you tonight. I know that's a lot, but next meeting, we need to probably have, you know, give us some guidance, for sure.
Prepared for that. The regular scheduled board meeting starts in about 18 minutes, so we will go ahead and adjourn and come back at 6 p.m. Thank you.